Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming to University of Houston tonight. I know it's a little cold and rainy and the temperatures are plunging a little bit, but I'm glad that as many of you that showed up could show up. I'm very excited about that. My name is Dan Wells. I'm the Dean of the College of Natural Science and Mathematics. And this is the second in the series, in our Energy Symposium series, Critical Issues in Energy. Through this series, we're taking a close look at topics in energy and bringing industry experts together to help us better understand the issues. Tonight's topic is LNG export. Is it good for the U.S.? Hopefully, we'll have an interesting and lively discussion tonight and learn more about the complex economic, energy security, and environmental issues surrounding the export of liquefied natural gas. This is our final event for 2013, but we have two more debates scheduled for next year in February and March. I hope all of you can make those events. February 11th is climate change. Is it a real threat? And March 4th, the day before my birthday, by the way, is renewable energy, a need for governmental support. So hopefully we'll see you all at those events as well. I would especially like to recognize our two media sponsors for the Energy Symposium series, the Houston Business Journal and Houston Public Media. Their support has been instrumental in broadening the awareness of this event. Thank you very much. With that, I'd like to get the evening started by introducing Dr. Ramanan Krishnamurthy. Dr. Krishnamurthy is the UH's Chief Energy Officer. He's a professor of chemical and biomolecular engineering and petroleum engineering in the College of Engineering, and also a professor of chemistry in the College of Natural Sciences and Mathematics. UH has identified energy as a key strategic focus for education, research, and technology incubation. And as Chief Energy Officer, Dr. Krishnamurthy leads these efforts and has been instrumental in helping plan and coordinating this event. Please welcome Dr. Krishnamurthy.
Thank you all for being here. This, as Dan mentioned, is the second in our series. It's LNG export, is it good for U.S.? We have a terrific lineup of speakers here and a terrific moderator here. I'm going to keep these remarks brief and try and get to the program. First of all, in terms of logistics, if you have got questions, and I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions, you've got two ways of communicating those. One is you can send me an email. It's uhenergy@uh.edu. Very simple, right? One word, uhenergy@uh.edu. All of you have smartphones, just email me. That's easy to do. The other one is you see index cards on where you're sitting. They would have been there where you were sitting. And take those, you can write your questions by hand, put your name down, because one of the things we want to do is actually get audience participation. So what we're going to do is the moderator is going to call you out and ask you to perhaps repeat the question that you wanted to ask. And so we're going to get more integrated with the audience, try and find ways to build this interactivity of the program. So before I step off and let the debate start, we've also changed one additional thing. We've got the moderator not just moderating the debate, but also casting the issues that are in front of us in a neutral way, so putting out where the issues are, and he's going to lead off the discussion by actually talking for about 10 minutes about what are the core issues around LNG export. And both these changes that we made in our program is thanks to feedback that we got from you. So please, as the program goes along, if you got additional feedback, please feel free to share with us. We will certainly be sending you a feedback mechanism through our Eventbrite. Send us back comments. We really appreciate that. And also, one final comment again, and I want to thank our media sponsors, the Houston Business Journal and the Houston Public Media, for their generous support for this program. So our moderator today is Jeff Pendergraft of the Galloway Group. The Galloway Group is a Houston-based firm engaged in strategic advisory and investment banking services for both domestic and international energy industry clients. And so they've got the who's who of both domestic and international clients, and they're a very well-recognized group. And Jeff is an outstanding person who sort of understands all of the nuances of the issues around LNG. He got his feet wet, if you will, by starting to think about how do you import LNG 10 years ago. And things have obviously changed, and now we're thinking about export. And that's in large part thanks to the kinds of developments that we talked about last time, which was hydraulic fracturing. Jeff holds a Bachelor's of Arts from Stanford University and a graduate degree from Stanford University also from the School of Law there. And he is a West Coast person. He grew up in the San Francisco area, the Bay Area, and then moved to Houston in '85. And he loved it so much that he's never gone back since. So thank you so much for being here, Jeff. He's also the founding member of the Environmental Law Society and a member of the Order of the COIF at Stanford University. So with no further delay, Jeff, thank you.
Thank you, Ramanan. It's my pleasure to be here tonight to moderate this panel. I think this is an interesting topic, one that's in critical importance, both from an economic, environmental, and geopolitical perspective. My role tonight is to introduce the topic, hopefully in an objective way. I'll try not to let my biases show. I think it may be best if I defer the introductions to the panelists until we get through the introduction, and then I'll go from there. So with that, start with some key observations. We're in the midst of a global transformation in the energy sector. And to paraphrase a former director of the CIA, his comment was, if the 19th century was the century of coal and the 20th century was the century of oil, the 21st century is a natural gas century. That's driven in large part by the tremendous amount of new discoveries of natural gas, particularly unconventional gas in shale gas reserves. And if exports are to occur, it's going to change a number of perspectives, both in terms of the pricing of LNG, liquefied natural gas, internationally, and the perspectives of the producers and suppliers of natural gas. The DOE, the Department of Energy, has already granted approval for exports to several projects and are in the midst of evaluating others. But the future of this export market, in my view, is likely to be determined by the market dynamics and to a lesser extent by the politics, which I'm sure you'll hear a lot about tonight. I mentioned the change in the natural gas resource base. Domestically, there are over 4,000 trillion cubic feet of natural gas reserves, more than a 150-year supply at today's technology and at today's demand rate. Huge resource base. And what that's doing is driving some significant regional price disparities. If you look at the blue line, which represents U.S. domestic natural gas price based on Henry Hub, and compare that to the red line, which is European gas price, and the green line, which represents an Asian gas price, there's a significant difference, which is a reflection of this supply abundance in the U.S. and the significant demand occurring elsewhere in the world. So what's that done? It's generated a huge number of export projects in North America. This slide represents those projects that have been announced. There's more in the works. A huge number of projects. There's no way that all of these projects can be built, but that significant supply coupled with the price differentials regionally has generated a lot of activity. So what's the process to determine whether or not these projects will be built? Well, the political process is that you have to get approval from the U.S. Department of Energy. to export natural gas and to export oil from the United States. That approval process is almost automatic in the case of exports to our free trade agreement partners. But if you seek to export to non-free trade agreement countries, and most of the demand, Japan, Asia, over in Europe, are non-free trade agreement countries, there has to be a finding that the export is in the national interest. At this point, the Department of Energy has granted approval to 4 projects. There's an additional 20 in line. And for each of those projects, at least for the non-FTA markets, they have to make a decision that it's in the national interest to grant that export approval. In addition to that, export approval, the projects themselves have to be approved from the normal permitting process for environmental control, siting control, air issues, water issues, whatever. That process is managed largely by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The factors that are contributing to the DOE export decisions have been highly politicized. There's pressure from industry. There's some support or non-support from the American public. Significant international demand. The Japanese are lobbying aggressively, not only for export approvals, but for free trade agreement status. So you've got a group of supporters and opponents, represented by our panelists tonight, that have lined up around this issue. From a macroeconomic standpoint, if you take a look at global LNG supply-demand and focus on the projects around the world that have been announced, there's far more supply of LNG planned than demand as you get out in the out years beyond 2020. So for a period of time, it tends to be a supplier's market, but it looks like if you believe all these projects are going to be built, that will shift into a buyer's market in the future. So to wrap this up, there's some significant uncertainty around what's going to occur here. The energy industry has always been a volatile industry. It's been a cyclical industry. On the supply side, shale gas reserves exist not only in the U.S., but in virtually every other continent around the world. How much of that is going to be developed? On the demand side, there's several drivers of increased demand. As a result of the price differentials, you're seeing a lot of power plant conversion from oil-based fuel oil or diesel to natural gas. You're seeing natural gas as a transportation fuel and in industrial use. So there's a lot of macro issues on the demand side. And technology advances will affect both the supply and the demand. My comment, I guess, on trends to watch is watch the world natural gas prices. At the moment, liquefied natural gas in Asia and Europe is being priced off of an oil-based formula. As more and more LNG becomes available, that's going to switch to a gas-based formula. And then the substitution for natural gas for oil-based fuels is another key trend to watch to see how all this is going to play out. So with that, let me introduce our first panelist for this evening. John Felmy is Chief Economist of the American Petroleum Institute. His areas of emphasis are the economic, statistical, and policy analysis for the Institute. This includes managing the production of the Institute's weekly and monthly petroleum statistics. John received his bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from the Pennsylvania State University and his PhD in economics from the University of Maryland. John's a member of several professional associations. I think to demonstrate John's credibility and his longevity with the industry, I would note that his second job was with the oldest pipeline in the country, a pipeline that was built in 1879, so John's been with the industry for a while. John?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I did work on the Tidewater oil line, which was the oldest pipeline. It was originally built in 1879. I didn't work on it then, but the Tidewater line is actually kind of interesting because it was built by the independents from northwest Pennsylvania, diagonally down south through Pennsylvania near Williamsport into Bayonne, by the independents who were trying to break John D. Rockefeller's hold on transporting oil. Now, how did they transport oil back then? Rail. Now think about it, fast forward, what are we seeing right now? Oil being transported by rail. And so it's amazing the cycles that you have and so on. It was a 6-inch cast iron line screwed together with collars and dug by hand. They operated it for a dozen years or so and then sold out to John D. as part of the Standard Oil Trust. So that's your first history lesson of the day. It is interesting, it's still in the ground. My job was a sniffer. I'd walk along the lines trying to find out if there's leaks. Real advanced technology, you know, and so on. So, but it was a good job. It was better than my first job, which was working on a sawmill, which other than it's hard work, it's dangerous, and it doesn't pay much, a sawmill job is a good job for a youngster. So it taught me one thing, that maybe an education was a good idea. Anyway, I think it's just wonderful also that we're having this discussion tonight. Because think about the discussions we've had even as short as 5 years ago, where over the last years that I've been analyzing energy, all we've been thinking about is scarcity. I first started studying energy in 1973 when I was in the Penn State debate team, and so I do enjoy debates. But the topic was resolve the federal government should control the supply and utilization of energy in the United States, because we just had the OPEC embargo, and you know, everybody was talking about scarcity. You had the Club of Rome, Meadows and Meadows, Forrester, and so on, who was basically saying we were going to run out of everything by now, not just energy, but everything, and how wrong they were. Because that group of folks didn't take into account two important things, technology development and markets. And if you look at the oil industry over its 154 years, you've seen that time and time again. And as Dan Yergin likes to say, you know, we ran out of oil 4 times. Well, we never did, of course, but what's happened is a change so that each time technology marches forward. And so we've seen dramatic technology changes in the last 15 to 20 years in 3 big areas. The first is deep water drilling, drilling in 2 miles of water. I remember when I first looked at deep water drilling back in the early 90s, we thought there were a couple billion barrels of oil. Now we've found tens of billions of barrels because of technology. Canadian oil sands, dramatically lowering cost, commercial, now is going to supply a huge amount of oil to the United States, hopefully, if they move forward with the Keystone pipeline. And the arguments that somehow stopping Keystone is going to stop oil sands development are just silly. The Canadian oil sands are worth 10 times Canada's GDP. They're going to be developed. You know, they're going to go somewhere. And if you want lower emissions, they should come to the United States, and so on. And finally, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. Dramatic leap forwards because of the, you know, folks like George Mitchell and so on, who, you know, is very important to Galveston and down the way and Woodlands and so on. And so what we've seen is this has changed everything. I mean, it really is a game changer. Whereas previous attempts at trying to change policy failed miserably, you know, in terms of back of restrictions on gas use, pricing and allocation controls that caused gas lines, taxes that didn't make any sense. And so we're beyond that right now. And so as we look out into the future, the LNG case is something that we need to take seriously. Is it good for the country? I believe it is. And I'll try to demonstrate a couple things to show that and so on. But you know, there are concerns that have to be addressed. So first of all, I say, you know, it says facts for addressing energy policy. Well, you know, unfortunately in Washington, too much of discussions go on in terms of myth and wishful thinking instead of facts and reality. And so I love this cartoon from Dilbert, where Alice says, you know, I got your stupid email or your stupid link to that stupid scientific study. I don't care about your so-called facts. I know I'm right. And too often that's the debate that goes on in terms of energy in Washington, D.C., a lack of reality. Or my favorite one is also this from the Wall Street Journal, where it says, I love you. You're the only one I know who shares my love of hydraulic fracturing. So what's the issue? It all comes down to Econ 101, I believe, in terms of what the decision is, and I think it's supportive of exports. You've got your standard supply and demand curves. And so if you're going to export, you're going to increase demand, shift the demand curve to the right, and the supply curve, then it comes down to is how steep is that curve? If it's flat, you have very little price impact. And you more than make up for the minor price impacts by increased production of natural gas as a result of it, and value added that you generate from selling natural gas at $17 a million BTU. And so I think if you look at the data, it's supportive of this. And we collect drilling statistics quarterly, and if you look at some of the drilling statistics, I think it's supportive of this. The first is that what you've seen is, yes, there's a slowdown in natural gas development drilling. But exploratory drilling still continues, because if you have a lease, you have to drill it or you lose the lease. And so if you look at that kind of information, it shows there's a lot of gas that could come out. And if you go through my neck of the woods in Pennsylvania, dead center in the Marcellus Shale area, you see a lot of stuff's not connected. And so if you have that potential supply impact, then you need to move forward in terms of where you could sell that gas and develop supplies, develop jobs, and so on. And so the summary from our statistical analysis by ICF clearly shows that you can generate tens of thousands of jobs, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs. You have a GDP that is a significant increase in terms of the benefits that you have. You do not have especially big price impact. Even in a very high export case of 16 BCF, you have a dollar impact, and 39 cents at the low case. And so basically I think that if you look at most of the studies that are out there, and you can go to our website and see some of it, you can go to the DOE website in terms of what there are a couple that disagree with this point of view. I think their assumptions are not accurate, but nevertheless, I think the evidence shows that we will benefit from doing it. What will that do? Well, it'll help the whole economy. You know, we're an industry that people forget about. We employ directly or indirectly almost 9 million people. And so think about being able to continue to expand the natural gas export facilities, to be able to develop more natural gas supplies, oil supplies, and so on, and what it means in terms of folks. And of course, you all know where we have direct employment in terms of oil and gas production and drilling and refineries and things like that. We're a big industry. We're an important industry, but we're largely ignored and so on. The key plea that we have is approve the projects and let the market work, okay? If you have all these projects that are approaching what is the demand for LNG worldwide, they're not going to go forward. These are massive investments. Let the market make that decision rather than having Washington picking winners and losers. Because we know very well from Washington that they can't do it. Well, actually, they're pretty good at picking losers. But nevertheless, in terms of winners and losers, you know, that's the challenge that we face going forward. And then if you look at all the industries and so on out there, this is not just rig workers. This is not just roughnecks. These are people all across the economic spectrum that can benefit from this. And what I really love to see when I drive through central Pennsylvania now, where I grew up, I see things I never saw as a kid growing up. Help wanted signs. You know, think about that, a depressed economic area that now is the 7th fastest growing city in the country. They have to let the gas workers leave town so that you can have enough hotel space for the Little League World Series. It's wonderful. And if you look at all the activity going across US 6, the Grand Army of the Republic Highway, you see how much an area can benefit from it. It's real. I just wish I owned property back there that had resources, but I was too dirt poor to have that. I'm just a country boy, former dirt poor country boy who got to college with $20 in my pocket. And you know, now if you graduate from high school, you take a technical training opportunity at the Pennsylvania College of Technology, you can come out and support a family. And that's what's exciting in terms of the economy right now, because we have such a skill set challenge and so on. And this is real, that we really need. So what's going on with gasoline and diesel prices? Well, I just put this chart to say, if you want to understand how gasoline prices move, you need to divide crude prices by 42, the number of gallons in a barrel, most important number on earth. And then you can see how the correlations are very high. You've got gasoline prices that are higher than, diesel prices are higher than gasoline because it's not your father's diesel fuel, and we spent billions of dollars creating ultra low sulfur diesel, and it's taxed more. So anyway, that's the oil side. What's going on with gas? This is in dollars per million BTU. As mentioned earlier, how natural gas in Asia is tracking more of the BTU price of oil. This is a couple days old, but you can see what's happened, how those things have diverged in terms of dollars per million BTU, with the top being West Texas Intermediate. If it was Brent, it'd be even higher, and so on. Why? Gas production, up dramatically. You know, we went around for about 12 years where gas production was virtually flat. And that's why everybody talked about importing LNG. I remember Alan Greenspan talking about it. You know, and so what's happened? Well, now with these huge increases in production, we see an opportunity to export. And these are from the basins around the country. You know, the Marcellus is the one up in the northeast, which is the real big one in there. But you've got these pockets all over in terms of different things. Some are oil focused in the sense of Bakken and some of Eagle Ford, but a lot of them are also gas and so on. And these numbers basically show probably a conservative estimate from one of Lisa's studies, but there's a lot of oil and gas out there. It's a worldwide phenomenon. And that's important because if we don't act now in terms of LNG opportunities for export, we could lose that market. There's a whole host of shale gas coming potentially online in other parts of the world. We're ahead of them because we have individuals being able to own resources below ground, whereas most of the rest of the world, that's not true. And so there's little incentive to develop it. We also have technology more than anybody else, and we've got a rule of law that's supportive of this. But if we hesitate, we could lose it all, lose that market opportunity that is really once it's gone, it's gone. And then you've got conventional developments in East Africa that are truly amazing. You know, whoever thought you'd be finding gas in Israel and so on. Why? We have the technology. Those of you who remember the $6 Million Man, Lee Majors, he was just, I just saw him doing some advertisements recently for hearing aids. So we all need technology as we age. I'm not being, but that's, you know, how technology changes and so on. But that's really the key. And so what it's going to mean if we develop this opportunity, we're going to have millions of jobs, trillions of dollars in investment, and hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue. And this is from an IHS study that's available easily. We also have conventional oil and gas. And all I've been talking about is unconventional. We also have conventional gas resources that are huge. But most of them are off limits. And so if we can have a coherent policy that allows us to be able to develop markets, see more expansion of it, it's going to be wonderful in terms of a jump start to the economy that's desperately needed. So I'm going to close with a couple quick quotes, and then we'll turn to, you know, this is from Atlas Shrugged. It was by Ellis Wyatt, who was the oil character in Atlas Shrugged. And when they asked me whether I wanted to be on the left or right up here, I said, well, I've got a Who is John Galt bumper sticker, so you can figure out where you're going to put me. Anyway, he opined on what technology would do for oil. This is 1957 and so on. And it's just, you know, basically a summary of what we've seen in terms of the oil industry for its 154 years. We have a slightly different view from the former Secretary of Energy, Mr. Chu, who said, well, we're going to see all these new technologies develop that could change a lot. I hope he's right, but we haven't seen them yet. And so what we need to do is move forward with a rational, coherent policy that addresses things like LNG exports, addresses tax policy, addresses you know, regulations and so on. And we really have an opportunity. You know, this is not the first time that we've been thinking about running out. It was mentioned earlier that the 19th century was coal century. Well, it was interesting because an economist, William Stanley Jevons, wrote a book called The Coal Question, where he opined that we were going to run out of coal. Well, that didn't happen either. And so let's really look at the facts. Let's look at the opportunity that we have. And I think you'll then decide that LNG exports are good for the country. So let me stop there, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, John. And now with what I think will be a little different perspective, let me introduce Scott Morrison. Scott joined the American Public Gas Association in December of 2010 and currently serves as the Government Affairs Manager. He's responsible for implementing legislative strategy and assisting in regulatory activities. Prior to joining APGA, Scott served as the Energy Committee Legislative Assistant for Senator Evan Bayh. And while with Senator Bayh, Scott worked on numerous issues, including comprehensive energy and climate policy, natural gas reform, and advanced vehicles. Scott holds a bachelor's degree, Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. I did that on purpose. Yeah, Scott, that was because Scott came from the wrong side of San Francisco Bay. He grew up in Berkeley, and as a Stanford graduate, that's difficult to tolerate. But he is doesn't demonstrate his bias, although he's a dedicated Wolverines fan. When he took his job at APGA, showed up for work and started up his computer, there was a Ohio State logo scrolling across the screen, and he's still there, so there you go.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you to Ramanan, thank you to Jeff, thank you to John. It's truly a privilege to be here with all of you. I am now in the lion's den, I suppose. As you've surmised, I am the representative of the American Public Gas Association, which represents not-for-profit, publicly owned natural gas distribution systems. In English, what that means is we take natural gas, we add an odorant to it at the city gate, and we deliver it to homes and businesses. APGA opposes the export of LNG, so I'm hoping there aren't too many things thrown at me here in Houston. I'm hoping to have a pleasant experience, so please keep them at least soft. So one thing I want you to keep in mind before I get into the arguments about why APGA opposes the export. This theme is that you're going to hear a lot of top-line conclusions about LNG exports, sort of pithy slogans, one-sentence summaries. And you know, the reality is you have to, excuse the phrase, dig a little deeper to figure out what the impacts of LNG exports are for this country. And so keep that in mind as this debate goes on. And that applies equally to me as it does to John or anybody else. So to understand APGA's position and why we oppose, you have to know who we are. As I said, not-for-profit, publicly owned natural gas utilities. We are the only national association who is dedicated to affordable, safe delivery of natural gas to its consumers. Effectively, we are a consumer-based organization. We have members in now 37 states. That slide needs to be updated. We serve about 5 million customers, and most of our members have 5 employees or less and serve cities and towns, both rural and urban, that are much smaller than Houston, to say the least. But these are small communities that have made the choice to put in natural gas because essentially investor-owned entities couldn't make any money to provide natural gas service. So you can understand from our perspective the idea that we have this newfound bounty in natural gas. And one of the things I want to point out is actually that 4,000 TCF number that you all saw, that's the high end of the estimates that are out there about how much supply there is. The National Petroleum Council, the Energy Information Administration, and others really puts the range between 2,000 and 2,750 TCF. The amount of gas we have and that we can actually produce matters when we're talking about exporting. And our point is that, look, you don't make policy based on the most optimistic assessment. You make policy humbly, common sense. So we can't expect to base a policy on something that's 1,000 or 1,200 TCF higher in terms of its resource base than what a lot of sort of rational, normal, mainstream organizations are saying. Humility. So there's 3 elements for me to discuss. APGA's rationales for opposing LNG exports, who benefits, and some of the claims that are out there. So why do we oppose? To steal the economist language, though I am clearly not an economist by training, the opportunity costs of export are too high. Why? Price impacts on consumers. There's probably only one thing John and I can agree on. We probably disagree to the amount of how much the price impacts will be. But the reality is, if you export, prices will go up. By how much? Well, the Department of Energy says 3 to 9%. Purdue says anywhere from 3 to 40%. Point is, no matter what study you look at, they all agree. I mean, what you have is consumers around this country who've seen their utility bills drop by $1,000, putting an extra $1,000 of disposable income in their pocket. To speak nothing of the businesses that now utilize natural gas, whether you're in manufacturing, and that can be the large ethane crackers all the way down to one of our members who serves a chicken processing plant in Georgia. Now that may be a humble small thing, and that may not stir the passions as much as a large 10,000 person facility. But to that community, that chicken processing plant means jobs. It means livelihood. It means dollars in the community. That's real to them. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, we're 4 or 5 years into this essentially energy revolution. Why are we so quick to now export this away to our economic competitors? Second, lost opportunity to achieve the national goal of reducing our energy dependence. Every administration, Republican or Democrat, has made reducing our dependence on foreign energy sources its top priority. Now, whether or not they've actually taken any meaningful steps to accomplish that is a separate question. But what you have in natural gas, in both CNG and LNG, is a technology that is here right now, that it's available. We don't have to wait 5 years. We don't have to do another 10 years of R&D like some other options that are out there. We can do this now. The rest of the world has already done this, and we're behind. But we can make the choice to put forth serious policies to aid that deployment. And the reality is, whether the oil we import, whether it comes from allies and friends like Canada or Mexico, or whether it comes from, excuse the cliche, but less than friendly, hostile nations, be they Venezuela, be they Saudi Arabia. The fact of the matter is, it's good for our geopolitics and our energy security to reduce that dependence on those countries. Moreover, even if it's from a friendly country like Canada or an allied country like Canada, reducing our trade deficit is of paramount importance. And the primary driver of our trade deficit is importing oil. And right now we have a domestic resource and a widely available technology that will allow us to make a meaningful difference in terms of our energy dependence. And if we export on top of future domestic demand, which we know is coming, the delta that makes CNG and LNG vehicles, that price delta between $1.50 CNG and $3.50 for gasoline, or $2 for LNG and $3.80 for diesel, that starts to shrink. And so that critical national and energy security goal, that opportunity shrinks with it. And last, the potential for a squandered manufacturing renaissance. The reality is, for 50 or 60 years in this country, we have been hemorrhaging manufacturing jobs. We finally have a domestic resource that is making our manufacturing viable again, and it's affordable shale gas. That's why you're seeing over $100 billion of private investment lined up by companies, both U.S. and foreign companies, BASF, Dow, you name your company, all lining up, waiting to invest and lining up to invest capital in this country to provide new manufacturing capacity and new jobs. How many? Well, again, you can look at a study, Boston Consulting Group from August of 2013. They project that another 2.5 to 5 million jobs could be created in manufacturing by 2020, in 7 years. Point is, if we layer on exports, manufacturers are highly price-sensitive entities. And they'll do what they've done before because they're rational actors. They will pack up their operations and they will take them somewhere else in the world. And what's lost to us, i.e. the United States, is those well-paying jobs. And for us, all of these together make the opportunity cost too high. And really, one or two other points really quickly before I move on. It's really about that domestic demand. It's about the supply. Is the supply estimate really 4,000 TCF? We say no. We hope we're wrong. We absolutely hope we're wrong. But the point is, if you don't know how much supply you actually have, or there's a question about that, plus you know you have burgeoning demand, it's projected that manufacturing could, for context, we produce about 66 BCF per day in 2011 of natural gas. DOE projects this year we'll produce about 69 BCF per day. If you layer on a projected 10 to 11 BCF per day of new demand for manufacturing, 10 to 13 BCF per day from electric generation because of coal retirements fundamentally, plus 3 BCF per day for natural gas vehicles, plus at least 4.5 BCF per day of FTA exports to Mexico, and up to 7. You're talking somewhere in the neighborhood conservatively of a 20 to 25 BCF per day increase. And the question becomes, can industry respond in a timely fashion? because historically they've never faced that type of demand challenge. And the second point is, from a consumer's perspective, we see, though not here in Houston obviously, movements at the local, state, and potentially national level to restrict access. So even if that gas is all there, when you have communities in Pittsburgh, other places in Pennsylvania, you have Vermont, which has no shale gas but has banned hydraulic fracturing, one of the most nonsensical things I can possibly imagine. But the point is, even if it's there, if we don't have the access to it, if the federal government moves, which we don't think it will, but it might, if the states move, we don't know, or if local communities prohibit production, all of this is moot. And all we're doing with exports is layering on new demand when we're restricting access, potentially. So who benefits? Now this is the part that I expect to get a few things thrown at me. So one of the primary studies that proponents like to tout was done by Near Economic Consulting. It was contracted by DOE to analyze the macroeconomic impacts of LNG exports. What that study found, now this is one of those sort of short, pithy phrases that I told you about that you're going to have to peel back a few layers, and we'll go through it. It said that at every level for exports, there are net economic benefits, just as every trade theory posits that it will. The problem is, the question that you really have to ask is who benefits? And Near Economic Consulting study actually provides that answer within the first 10 pages. If you start on page 7, there's 2 quotes I'd like to read. Expansion of LNG exports has 2 major effects on income. It raises energy costs, and in the process depresses both real wages and the return on capital in all other industries. Page 8. Higher natural gas price, households with income solely from wages or transfers in particular will not participate in any of the benefits from LNG exports. Higher natural gas prices in 2015 can also be expected to have negative impacts on output and employment, particularly in sectors that make intensive use of natural gas. And then on page 9, there's a great little chart that I wish I'd put on my slide, but I didn't have enough room. And it shows precisely those things, that wage impacts and return on capital investments for almost all other sectors of the economy, agriculture, manufacturing, services, you name it, are all negative. And who benefits? Oil and gas producers. Now, the reality is, and this is controversial, what this functions as is a wealth transfer. It's out of the pockets of small communities in this country. It's out of your pockets if you use natural gas or the products that you buy are made from them. And it goes to oil and gas producers. That's what their own study says. That's what they use to tout. Now, moreover, to add a little bit more to this, one of the points that NERA also makes is that new sources of income are created, and John touched on this. There's the money that accrues to our economy from selling the gas, and then to people who own stock in these oil and gas companies, you see increased income from that. The problem is, according to the St. Louis Federal Reserve Board report on the status of the recovery, stock wealth is unevenly held, with the vast majority of stocks owned by a relatively small number of wealthy families. Pew Research, 53% of Americans, this is from this summer, don't own any stock, including in retirement plans. So depending on what slice of the population you want to look at, if it's all Americans, then you're talking about 159 million people who don't participate in these benefits. If you're just looking at adults, it's about 116 million people who do not participate in the benefits. The other sources of income that are generated by exports do not accrue to them. All they see is increased costs. And there's also 46.5 million people who live at or below the poverty line in this country. And guess what? Their costs are going to go up, and they're not going to participate in any of the benefits. So this notion that, well, everyone shares this prosperity because 97% of oil and gas company stock is owned by American investors, that sounds good. But peel back the layers, and what you see is the benefits are accruing to a very small number of people, both in NERA and in terms of stock ownership. And to us, that violates the most basic tenet of public policy, regardless of your ideology. The purpose of public policy is to do the most good for the greatest number of people. And unfortunately, what this does is precisely the opposite. It does the most harm for the benefit of the fewest number of people. Two other ones and I'll wrap up. Another argument you'll hear is exporting LNG is good for U.S. geopolitical interests. Who wouldn't want to provide our friends and allies with natural gas when they're dependent on Russia or Iran? The problem is there's no mechanism under current or proposed law to ensure that gas will actually go to our allies or our friends. Why? Because the gas will be sold where the price is highest. And yes, right now, gas in Japan may be $16 to $18 per MMBTU. But in 5 years or in 10 years, if the price is higher in China, guess what? They'll export the gas to China. And the reality is, do we really want to be giving our gas to our nearest economic competitors, like China, or to our friends and allies who don't open up their markets to our broader goods and services, like Japan? In fact, we're in the midst of negotiating a free trade agreement with Japan and other Asian countries called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, why would we give away our best chit, natural gas, before we've concluded that broader negotiation? Why shouldn't we get, at the bare minimum, in return for our natural gas, access to Japan's auto markets, access to Japan's beef, be able to export beef to Japan, among other goods and services? Fundamentally, that just strikes me as foolish. And moreover, I'm going to emphasize this point. The gas will be sold where the price is highest, not where dependence on Russian or Iranian gas is highest. And there may be a confluence between those things now, but we don't know what happens in 5 or 10 years. Again, humility. And the last point, blocking exports will cost jobs. As a side note, a wise person once told me, and this applies to me as well, you should view all jobs estimates with attendant skepticism. In other words, be skeptical. Charles Rivers and Associates did a study that compared the use of 5 BCF per day of natural gas in manufacturing versus exporting 5 BCF per day to other countries around the world. And what that study found is that gas contributes twice as much to GDP, 4 to 5 times as much to employment, and nearly 3 times as much to the reduction of the trade deficit. In more concrete numbers, manufacturing produces $4.9 billion in GDP impact, 180,000 jobs, and $52 billion in impact in terms of our trade imbalance. Compared to 5 BCF of exports, which will generate $2.3 billion in GDP impact, 22,000 jobs, and about $18 billion reduction in our trade deficit. So I'll wrap up with this. Beware the top line, pithy sort of assumptions, and peel back the layers and start asking tough questions. Because what you'll find is that fundamentally, exports benefit a few and hurt a lot of us. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we're now going to move on to the question and answer portion of the program. And thank you, Scott, for your comments, and John. I think we've got the sides of the debate framed up. Let me begin. I think Ramanan is collecting questions, and we'll take some here from the audience in a minute, but let me get things kicked off. So there's clearly various groups debating this issue, and I guess my first question is, where do you think this debate is going to play out? Is it going to play out in Congress? Is it going to play out in the administration? We've already seen DOE grant some export approvals. Is it going to play out in the court or somewhere else? So first question is, where's it going to play out? Second question is, where should it play out? So Scott, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think the reality is it's going to play out at the regulatory level. DOE and FERC, this is clearly within their bailiwicks, and Congress is not going to touch this with a 10-foot pole. The reason Congress isn't going to do anything is because essentially they'll upset one constituency or another, and members of Congress, regardless of party, their preference is to not make anybody angry. So if they weigh in, and they weigh in on our side, then they make a lot of other folks happy. If they weigh in on John's side, then they make a lot of other folks unhappy. So Congress isn't going to touch this. DOE, and again, this comes down to the FTA versus non-FTA portion. Jeff, as you said, there's the non-FTA, exports to non-FTA countries It is assumed that exports are in the public interest, but that is a rebuttable presumption. In other words, someone can challenge this. The issue is, from an organization that has tried to challenge these, we're left to prove a negative. How can we prove that something isn't in the national interest? That's, in our mind, an unreasonable burden. Regardless, that's how it's going to play out. It's going to play out at DOE, it's going to play out at FERC. There's the potential for litigation, of course. This is America. We apparently love lawsuits. There is talk among some groups that they may try and sue the Department of Energy for one rationale or another, be it environmental groups essentially looking to halt fracking, be it, name your constituency, someone could potentially threaten a lawsuit. In short, it's going to be at DOE, it's going to be at FERC, it's going to be less likelihood, but potential for litigation as well.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, it's clearly a regulatory issue. The issue of lawsuits, I mean, we've got natural gas rules and regulations that date to the 30s. This stuff's pretty well vetted. I don't see any possibility that some of these organizations are going to be able to litigate it successfully on that. Of course, you never know how certain circuits will perform in terms of reviewing that. But I think, again, what you're going to look at is if these are put up in front of it, and Secretary Moniz has been very positive in terms of saying what he's going to do and expediting it. So let's move forward with the projects and let the market work.
Let me jump in. One potential area of concern, at least to APJ, about the litigation route and about sort of DOE policy is the fact that right now DOE has not gone through a rulemaking process to establish what constitutes the public interest, as they did for importing natural gas in 1984 under President Reagan. In fact, Reagan's DOE paused consideration of import applications, went through a public process to take comment, to take input about what constitutes the public interest. Do consumers have a voice? Do manufacturers have a voice? Do oil companies, oil and gas companies, and other companies that want to export have a voice? Point is, they're operating without having gone through a formal rulemaking process. And to us, that fundamentally doesn't make sense. And there's been talk of this, and the point, DOE is essentially winging it. They've picked 3 criteria that were used essentially for importing natural gas and applied it to exporting, which we would argue is fundamentally absurd. They're 2 very different things with 2 very different sets of consequences. That's one area that folks have tossed around, let alone, to repeat myself, some environmental groups are interested in sort of NEPA analysis and other things.
Okay, so Safa Kamal in the audience? Can you get your microphone? Maybe you can ask your question and we'll have panelists repeat it up here.
I was just curious to know, there's a gas value chain and you can take the gas and do many things with it, but isn't it easier to just make LNG and export it rather than set up a new chemical plant if you got to go get cost of setting it up and getting approvals and stuff like that? I'm just curious.
Well, I think this is a complex question. I mean, first of all, it's not just methane we're talking about. It's natural gas liquids, which are not, they're now exported some, but that's really a lot of the value chain for chemicals. So there is a little bit of an issue you've got to deal with it. In terms of the value chain, I think it comes down to we're dealing with, if you're talking about chemicals, you're dealing with one type of manufactured product versus another type of manufactured product. The arguments that I've heard from some folks are saying, oh, well, you're just exporting a raw commodity are just simply wrong. It's a manufactured product that costs over $10 billion to make, and if you can get $17 for it in the Far East, then that's a value-added benefit that the country will get, and it is broadly diffused through the U.S. economy. I mean, that you start with the producers of gas, which the whole point about it's narrowly owned by wealthy people, no, I'm sorry, maybe direct ownership of stock, but we've done this analysis. And if you look, and every one of you probably has an investment in an oil company, either as part of an IRA or a pension fund. And so while you may say that direct stock ownership is concentrated, not stock ownership. And it's got broader implications on that.
Scott, you
Sure.
want to take the question?
Sure. To the first part about isn't it cheaper or easier to export rather than set up chemical and other types of natural gas intensive facilities. I think you have to ask yourself, what's the GDP impact between some level of processing and exporting LNG, liquefying it, going through that process, versus building a truly value-added product here in the United States? The simple analogy is this: would you rather export the wood, or would you rather export the chair? From a GDP standpoint, you'd rather export the chair. And the fact of the matter is, if you weigh out the use of natural gas in steel, aluminum, chemicals, name your manufacturing industry, and weigh that GDP impact, and weigh that jobs impact, and weigh that trade impact, using natural gas here for manufacturing wins every time, hands down. It's twice as much of an impact in GDP, it's 4 to 5 times as much in terms of jobs, and 3 times as much in terms of our trade deficit. To the second point about ownership, the issue is, again, 53% of people do not own stocks at all. 2, you can't conflate people who own 1,000 stocks with someone who owns 1 or 2 stocks. Because in fact, when you get into the numbers of how many people, for instance, pension plan owners, only 4% of pension plan stock is actually oil and gas stock. And there are similar low numbers throughout, whether it's an IRA or a mutual fund. And it depends. In fairness, it depends on what your mutual fund is or what your IRA is. But again, these are not broadly held benefits, even including mutual funds and IRAs. Because the reality is at least 116 million, if not 158 million people don't actually own any of this. Moreover, you have to dig down to the level of how many stocks do you own? Because the amount that the energy is going to go up, look, your energy costs are going to go up, and they'll continue to go up. And if you own 2 stocks in an export company, the increase in value in those 2 stocks or those 10 stocks isn't going to be enough to outweigh the cost increases you're getting on the energy side.
You have a follow-up?
Yeah, so the key thing I was really pointing to was to get, set up a new chemical plant today in the U.S., or set up a new refinery, or set up a new ethylene plant. The amount of regulation and local approvals that you would need is pretty high. So that's what I was also pointing to from a cost perspective. I truly agree. We should own the gas value chain as far as possible as we can, and because made products will get us more value. But are we able to set up the plants easily to make those products?
All right. So just quickly, because I want to move on to the next question, if you could just summarize, and John.
There's challenges of regulatory approval of both things. I mean, there's no question. And so I'd be a little cautious. It depends on where you're doing it. It depends on what the scope of the project is. I mean, there's no question that there's benefits. We've been saying this for a long time. There's benefits to the gas, from the gas revolution in terms of manufacturing and so on and so forth. But it's not a trade-off, okay? We will have the gas supplies if you look at the underlying data. And look, we talk about studies and so on. I encourage everybody, go to our website, look at the studies. You'll see that most of them are different from CRAs, which I disagree with the assumptions and how they put it together, and they are fairly unique in that, and there's a lot of other issues I can talk to you offline about that. But it's not a trade-off. If you are able to export gas and you get more supply, it's not a trade-off.
To the first part, absolutely. I'm sure it's easier to set up a chemical plant here in Texas than it is in my home state of California, to use an obvious example. Absolutely. It's totally location dependent on, where you're setting up this facility, how welcoming, how business friendly is the local community, how business friendly is the state. All of those things, you have to pick out a specific example. As far as trade-offs, the reality is, again, we keep coming back to the supply estimate. How much we have matters. And if the 4,000 TCF that seems to be the outlier in terms of resource estimates doesn't actually pan out, or we don't have access to it, when the mid-range studies are somewhere around 2,000 TCF and 2,700 TCF, make policy based upon, with a little bit of humility and a little bit of caution. Because, look, we want there to be 4,000 TCF. We all want that. But if we're wrong or if we can't get access to it, these decisions about exports have orders of magnitude of consequences higher if we're wrong.
Okay, we're getting a lot of questions from the audience. I want to try to get as many of these as we can. Rick, is it straight? Okay. You asked two questions. I want you to take the environmental question first, if you would. Yeah.
The question is, what should we decide if, in fact, we're talking about the environment? Should we export LNG? Is it good for the environment if we export LNG? Now, I'd like to put a little bit behind that.
Sure.
The big market, Tokyo, right? Fukushima shut down their nuclear power plants because they had to. Japan's going to shut down all their nuclear power plants. They're going to now run on natural gas. Is that good for the environment? Not if you believe in global warming because of CO2, because now you're going from nuclear power to CO2 generating from natural gas. So is that good? Plus, LNG it's expensive to liquefy, folks. Big capital cost. Gorgon is shutting down, or not putting on trains because it's now up to like $52 billion just to liquefy natural gas. Is it good for the environment? Because when you talk regulations, which will control this, we could easily be caught up. I'll add my second question. And that is that who is the 900-pound gorilla in the room? It's not LNG exporters. It is the power industry in the United States. Why is that? Because we're shutting down nuclear power plants. We haven't found a good way to use coal, capture all the CO2, all you environmental engineers, off of a power plant. All new power plants, in my view, will be natural gas based. If we have a growth in our economy, it will go to natural gas based power plants. So when the price of natural gas goes from, what is it, $3.56 a million today, to what I predict will be $6 to $8 a million, how did the economics work out on top of the environmental issues?
Okay, Scott, we'll start with you.
Wow. I feel like
Let's take the environmental issue first, and we'll come back maybe to the economics.
sure.
If we have
I
time.
feel like you could have a whole series of symposia on just that environmental question. That's a
Right,
fantastic question. I'll try and sum up. To try and answer your question succinctly, if you're making the climate change argument, because obviously the Earth is a global system, and if we're displacing coal with gas, then there's a net environmental benefit. If we're displacing nuclear, then probably not. But it gets down into the weeds so quickly of how much emissions there are from the liquefaction, how do you calculate the emissions of transporting the gas over there? To your point, yes, we're probably adding CO2 emissions on a net basis by shipping LNG over to Japan and replacing their nuclear. I think we do have to be a bit cautious about just using that one fact to sort of guide our policy. Why? Because U.S. emissions, we're probably the only country in the world whose emissions have declined significantly. And the reason for that is using natural gas, because we are displacing coal, which is more CO2 intensive, greenhouse gas intensive, and replacing it with something that's less CO2 intensive. Moreover, if you use gas directly, so if you use in your home, if you use in your business, that system from well to usage is over 90% efficient. And if you're comparing that to the use of electricity, just for example, the use of electricity is only about 27% system efficient. In other words, you lose 73% of the energy that was created at the power plant by the time you go and turn on your light switch. So we have to be cautious about using that one example to drive all of our environmental policy surrounding natural gas. The second question, I honestly forgot.
Let's start with that one and give John a chance here.
Well, in terms of environment, I mean, those demands are going to be supplied whether we do it with the United States or not. And so the decision on whether or not is going to be what are the economics and the wealth benefits to the U.S. of doing it. Because, you know, okay, Gorgon is more expensive, but you've got shale gas all over the world. Whether we supply LNG to Japan or not is going to affect their decision on nuclear power. And if we supply natural gas to China, then there's clearly environmental benefits from that. They're desperate in terms of the emissions and so on. So in terms of the environment issues, yes. The cost issues are also very, very relevant. But that is what the market should decide. That's what the deciders who say, I can make money off of these projects, that's what the market should decide, not the government interceding and saying, no, no, we know better. Because we've seen that happen in the past.
What I was really talking about is the U.S. regulatory environment with CO2. Because back to California, you're not going to build a coal-fired power plant, but if you've got people, they need energy. So natural gas is where it's going to go, I believe. I think there might even be a situation where we're forced to shut down power plants ahead of their natural life and putting them into natural gas.
Well, let's quickly, if there's a response to that, and then let's go on to some other questions.
Just that, you know, I hope we do have some more nuclear plants. I mean, there's some under construction, so hopefully we'll move forward on that. Yeah, I mean, it's a case of you're seeing expansion of natural gas, but again, it's not a trade-off. It's not an either-or trade-off of one for the other. If the supply's there, then it's going to cover everything. And in terms of total resource estimates, okay, maybe it's not 150 years, maybe it's 100 years, but that's still a lot of gas.
Scott, quickly?
Just that's sort of our point about future domestic demand, that you have essentially 50 to 70 gigawatts of coal being essentially going to be retired within the next 20 to 30 years, both because of the price of natural gas and because of EPA regulations, which mandate that new electric generation facilities are at emissions levels that are essentially a combined cycle natural gas plant. As far as, again, I'm being redundant, but as far as the supply matters. And if he's right, then this isn't as much of a problem. But again, we all have to sort of make policy based on, be a little conservative in our policy making, and base our estimates on the middle of the road rather than on the high end, in case we are wrong, in case the resources aren't there, or in case we don't have access to it.
Okay, moving on. Ulysses Tovar, I'm sure I butchered that name. There he is, in the back. You asked a question about other energy commodities. Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, so how will exports or lack of exports of LNG affect demand for coal or other energy commodities?
Okay, so the question is, how do exports of LNG affect the demand for other commodities? John, you want to take that one first?
Well, again, it gets back to what's the impact on supply. I mean, if there's no impact on supply, it doesn't have an effect. Okay? Now, the whole issue about using natural gas in other forms of use, clearly we talked about electric utility, and that's real. We've seen that increase. How big is the market for natural gas in vehicles? In heavy-duty trucks, I think there's a good market there. Small cars, no. You won't keep it. It's too expensive to convert it. So in terms of incremental demands on that, one has to be very cautious about, you know, kind of getting into these complicated things, because I like to hold up a chart that's from DOE that, if you've ever seen it, shows where energy comes from and how it's used. And some of these things, you know, they're just not competitive. You know, 93% of the fuel of vehicles of transportation is oil. It's not going to be electricity, it's not going to be wind, it's not, you know, and so on. And so to answer that question is very complex in terms of how you're going, and it depends on what the supply impacts are.
Scott, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, no, and I agree. It also just depends on what country. Sort of, we got into this before, just with the last question. What are the demands of the country to which you're exporting? What are they displacing with that natural gas? Are they displacing coal? Are they displacing nuclear? Are they doing both? It really is just so sort of specific in terms of, you know, you'd have to take one country as an example and analyze it from there, I think.
Okay. Bill Clemens. Bill Clemens? There you go.
Scott,
If you're promoting the fear that prices will increase in natural gas for exporting, and the idea is to keep natural gas here in the United States, why should we export anything? Why should we export grain? Why should we not keep everything in the United States, drive the prices down, free food? It would be great. Now, you would put the farmers out of business, as you would put the oil and gas producers out of business, but why should we be allowed to export anything?
Scott, I think you're the one to take
Sure,
that question.
sure. John, you don't want to take it? No, look, it's a good question. I think the first point you have to keep in mind is, one, because of FTA exports, we're exporting gas right now. There is a North American market, and guess what? It's actually working. The price last year bottomed out at $1.94. Now we're at $3.56, $3.60. And because of future domestic demand, that price is going to rise. Because of manufacturing, because of electric generation. Agreed. The amount for NGVs, though we would love it to be higher, is going to be small. But when you add up manufacturing and electric generation, that's a heck of a lot of demand, let alone direct use in houses, let alone vehicles, let alone exports to Mexico, which by 2016 are supposed to double to 4.5 BCF per day and up to 7 BCF per day. Now, to your question, to be fair, why shouldn't we ban everything? It's going to make John angry. Wheat is renewable. Okay? Wheat is a bad example because every year there's a new wheat crop. And we've argued a lot about the supply. But at the end of the day, at some point, this is a finite resource. And it has uses, particularly, as Jeff had mentioned in his opening, James Woolsey, former CIA director, saying we should be using our natural gas to break the power of OPEC. Absolutely. The reality is, one commodity is not like the other. Wheat and natural gas are not the same. They just aren't. And do we really want to turn around and sell a commodity that can have such positive impacts on our domestic energy and national security? APJ would say no, because of precisely that trade-off. Because at the end of the day, this is a finite resource, and other ones are renewable.
All right, we're kind of out of time here. John, I'm going to give you the last word to respond to that question.
I think that's an excellent point. You know, we want to export everything. The president has set as a goal doubling exports. But for some reason, when we start talking about energy, everybody goes, and, you know, I don't understand it. You know, it's a case of, again, I get back to is there a trade-off or isn't there? If there's sufficient supply, whatever the resource estimates you want to work with from, and they've been continuing to go up, and that's not even getting into methane hydrates, which are the big kahuna in terms of opportunity for natural gas. I mean, you're talking about a vast amount of energy that changes the whole world, or fundamental breakthroughs in some other areas. So let's let the market work. And if you can get a value added for your product that is a trade-off, if whatever you believe, go to the studies yourself and look at what you think and compare them and look at the assumptions and so on. I'm not going to do it. We think that the ICF study is a good study that breaks out the small impacts.
Okay, well, look, I apologize for not getting to all the questions. There were some excellent questions. You've been a great audience, and thank you very much for your attention.
Let's thank all of you. Thank you all for coming, and I hope I see you back February 11th for our climate change discussion. Thank you again.